Greetings, friends. Recently, I had the pleasure of inviting on Amaiguri for an interview regarding world building and the creation process. She is in many ways a modern Renaissance creative, writer, artist, game designer, all rolled into one.
Yeah, hello. My name's Belle, also known as Amaiguri on the internet. I'm a professional narrative designer and game writer, but in my spare time, I also just do the exact same thing. And I am currently working on a video game called All the Promised Burn, a fantasy knowledge based role playing game in which you play as a burned assassin trying to cope with the loss of her country and figuring out what she should do with her life now that the war is over.
What are your inspirations for the project? What inspired you to begin work on it and continue it with the medium and whatnot?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was in middle school, I was one of those kids that still had an imaginary world. And I met my best friend, shout out to the Dragon's Rose on Twitch, and she also still had an imaginary world. So we started sending each other's letters about what was happening in our worlds. And these letters eventually evolved into chapters of stories that each of us sent out to each other over the years. And over the years, we've had many worlds. So fast forward to 2018, and I just gone through a pretty rough breakup, so it was time for me to start another world. At the time, I was really inspired by Game of Thrones before its horrific final seasons, as well as the animes Made in Abyss and Violet Evergarden. For me, it was really Game of Thrones intrigue and the way the factions were always trying to one-up each other, as well as the way that even though everyone was kind of a terrible person, you still found reasons to sympathize with them. I felt that that was just a really uniquely powerful storytelling method. I also loved that Made in Abyss's world was so beautiful, even though horrible things were happening, and so it sort of balances out that the inherent darkness to its world with its beauty. And then, of course, Violet Evergarden's story, it really helped me reframe my own personal traumas and codependencies in a more healthy light, since that's a story also about getting over a breakup slash grief and trauma and so on and so forth. So Isaiah and its current game project, All the Promised Burn, are a mix of all these things. Gameplay wise, I'm a really big fan of like the unnecessary but immersive parts of games. Like the way the characters in Ni no Kuni 1 correctly walk up and down the stairs with one foot on each step, or the way in Night in the Woods, like you can't eat the pizza because whenever you try to grab the slices in the minigame, your friends are always grabbing the slices before you do. Or the way that when you climb to the top of pretty places in games, you can see really far and see beautiful things. Like in Breath in the Wild or in Genshin Impact. As a kid, actually, I used to spend a lot of time trying to jankily ride to the tops of hills in this game called Legacy of Rosemund Hill, which is a horse game you've probably never heard of. And so modern games that centralize that as part of its gameplay really make me very happy. Let's see, some other things. I recently played The Coffin of Auntie and Lele, and I loved how many times I was like, hey, this is stupid, why don't you just do this to solve the problem? Like, there's this one puzzle where you have to find a rope to climb out of out of a second floor hallway, and I was just like, why don't they just climb down the rug? And that was just actually the answer, was that they climbed down the rug. So I really loved that they just made you actually observe the environment and actually interact with it. And that was just something that I really wanted to try to bring to my game, is have people be actually observing the world that they're in and have that improve the gameplay. For the RPG side of things, so with the numbers and the progression systems, I actually get a lot of my experience from the tabletop scene. I'm regularly in two to four tabletop role-playing groups, playing various relatively crunchy systems like original Pathfinder or Shadowrun. I play a lot of Magic the Gathering, because I used to work at Wizards of the Coast. I'm also regularly playing pretty complex strategy board games like Twilight Imperium or Tzolk'in or Root. I'm not necessarily good at any of these things, but especially I'm not good at them in comparison to the like engineers and physicists I end up playing with, but they nonetheless really shape how I'm thinking about economic engines. So I'd say that those three things are really what have come together to make All the Promised Burn what it is.
So, in terms of like the Game of Thrones made this Violet Evergarden inspiration, is that kind of, because my understanding of the project is that it's kind of set after a conflict, after a war.
Yeah.
That's very much like how Violet Evergarden like tells its stories. It's like it's after all of the quote unquote plot relevant things have already occurred.
That's correct, yeah.
So how does that work when creating the kind of Game of Thrones factionalism, right? Is it like a lot of these factions are kind of like devastated after this large conflict? Like how does that work into like individual or group ambitions?
Yeah, that makes sense. What I'd say the way I'm sort of angling it is think about the conflict in the wake of World War One. The signing of I suppose this is not something I mentioned as much, but I also studied World War One and World War Two. But World War One particularly a lot in high school. I was part of the International Baccalaureate program, and you had to pick you as a school had to pick a thing to focus on, and they picked World War One and World War Two. And the really interesting thing about World War One and its ending is no one was the quote-unquote bad guys. It was just a bunch of people making really bad decisions, basically. And so I was also really inspired by how after World War One, it's not like World War One ended and then there was peace. It's World War One ended and then all of the problems that they had before World War One ended were still problems. Like everyone was still having issues with wanting to be nationalist or wanting to be colonialist or imperialist, and people acquiring or not acquiring the things that they wanted out of the peace treaty of Versailles was what set the stage for World War II 10 years later. So that's sort of where I'm coming from at it, is that the end of the war isn't actually the end of the conflict. So even though the war is over and assassinating people is not as good of an answer anymore, it's also still, there is still a lot of conflict in it. And what I like about having the story be from the perspective of an assassin is that she's realizing sort of what the limits are of violence as a tool in a political landscape that doesn't permit violence as much. So that's the thing that I find really interesting about that specific setting that I've been crafting.
And then with Maiden Abyss, that kind of inspiration, Maiden Abyss has some genuinely, in my opinion, fascinating character work when it comes to introducing like new characters to the story. You have the main trio who delve downward into the abyss, but then you have the characters they meet, and some of them are really, really like frightening and heinous characters. Do you have a type of like characterization like a character that like Bondrewd, where the entire plot or story arc of this part in your game changes around an NPC that you encounter or a character that you encounter in the game? Or is that like completely off and I'm mischaracterizing slightly?
No, I think that's absolutely how Maiden Abyss works. I think that in Isaiah, the way that the characters interact with each other tend to be a little bit more grounded in sort of a little bit more of a Game of Thronesy way, where you meet a new character and they're not instantly changing the whole story because they're just this powerhouse that's completely out there. Not unlike Bondrewd, who wins Dad of the Year cards or whatever.
What's a case of it's like in the arc with Bondrewd, it's like that whole arc changes tone. Then when they go to the Golden City with like Wazukan and Belaf, it's the same thing. The entire like tone of the story changes, while still of course maintaining its identity as like Maiden Abyss, but it's like how you actually go about solving the issues in that area and like the mechanics of the story change slightly. But
I think Maiden Abyss. Go ahead.
No, so you were going for you were saying you were going for like a Game of Thrones like route with that.
Yeah, I would say that Maiden Abyss, I think, ends up taking more of a backseat as an influence, but it nonetheless influences, I think, the world building. And while Game of Thrones, I think, ends up often feeling like you have those sort of magical moments in Game of Thrones where it's like, oh, the tree in the forest looks really pretty, and like you kind of have that, or that the wall is inherently very beautiful, and then you have that sort of step back from all of the worldly problems to be like, wow, beauty of nature and stuff. I think Maiden Abyss does that way more, where the human and man-made problems are, it's like you have human or man-made problems of the characters' creations, and then you take a couple steps out and you're like, wow, the abyss is really beautiful, though. Like at the end of the day, we're still going to go down into the abyss. And I have that It's definitely more of a background element. It's also something that is going to feature a lot more in the way that you actually navigate the world. The way I'm sort of describing it is that from a gameplay perspective, you're making knowledge checks like you might in a Dungeons and Dragons game or a Pathfinder game or something,
Right.
where your knowledge is the thing that unlocks the next part of the story rather than combat. And with this in mind, there is a little bit more made in abyss in those elements of the gameplay and moment to moment, like what you're doing outside of the story. Which is, I know, as a narrative designer, not necessarily the most excellent ludonarrative synchronicity, as we might call it in the industry, but I think what this will do is that while the story can be really heavy and political and like dark and broody, the player can get reprieve from having to be in that and will actually end up managing the pacing a little bit better, like emotionally, because in between the broody like story beats, the player has a moment to breathe and be like, but as a character, I still get to eat good food, I get to learn about what causes avalanches, I get to walk around and see this beautiful world. And so that's sort of how I'm managing the balance between those influences in my work.
All right. So on to the next question. Do you have a specific method or technique when it comes to building your world, the world building itself?
I usually just start with what interests me, honestly, which is usually characters and factions, as you may have surmised. My motto for character design is little girls, big guns, but the guns can be metaphorical. And then I develop the factions that they're from, whether that's countries or noble houses or gangs or whatever. But for things to be truly detailed, I need my factions to fight over resources. And what determines resources? Geography. So I don't have a lot of strong opinions about geography or land masses, so I tend to randomly generate the land masses, and then I try to apply Earth-like conditions to them to determine biomes, so that then I can place the factions in places that make sense within these biomes, and then I just sort of deduce their resource availability and language processing and so forth. Food logistics is one of my favorites. So the world building ends up being kind of frosting on the cake, but it also exists to serve the themes and characters and or gameplay ideas, sort of, and acting as a supporting role to further these things, or perhaps in the case of themes, it allows us to if the world building might let us take a look at some alternate solutions to the grand thematic question. So for example, in Isaiah, one of my key thematic questions is, what is it that makes someone a hero? And so every single country has its own hero story that they are, that sort of shapes the way that all of their culture works. This hero story sort of ends up guiding the way that the average person in the country thinks that they should act. So in this regard, even though you don't necessarily have a focus on every single one of these countries all of the time, their place in the story nonetheless gives the audience a glimpse at an alternate answer to the grand question, what does it mean to be a hero?
And so each of these different countries and cultures have a slightly different hero narrative, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct. For Nova Thule, and the North in general, they have a sort of retelling of the King Arthur narrative, which is pretty similar to a Jesus narrative, but where you have a very grand king who united things with how good he was, and then he died because the world was not ready for him, but he'll return one day. Is sort of the very basic bones of that story. But in the South, they have more of a story about how a bunch of people came together to build something that protected them. In this case, their Philosopher King. A bunch of people came together to build the Philosopher King, and the Philosopher King protected them. This is the Philosopher King from Plato's Republic. Although I also have influences from the Gollum story, the Jewish Gollum story, in the way that I have portrayed the Philosopher King, and so all the cultures have their own sort of story that dictate how they should act. As you can sort of see, the Southern culture is more about coming together and supporting a common cause that will you have to sort of play your role in the cogs of society, versus a northern story is a little bit more like, it takes one great person to unite and lead all of us, and that could be you. But at the same time, the northern story is also a story about how good people don't last very long in this world, so you kind of have to be a bad person to a certain extent. Like, they have morals, and also they say you shouldn't follow them because it's not as effective as being like a bad person or something. That's obviously simplifying a little bit about how these stories about how these myths, we'll say, interact with the mainline story, but that's sort of what I'm going for.
Okay, so on to the third question. What made you choose a video game for your project's medium rather than a comic or a web series?
I think the simplest answer to this is that this is my medium, right? So I went to college for game design at DigiPen Institute of Technology, and I have my bachelor's in game design. But the thing about the game industry is, in order to get a job in the game industry, you also already have to be doing the thing that companies want you to do. So originally, Isaiah, as you kind of heard, was just a bunch of emails going back and forth, but it is nonetheless easily the work that I am the most proud of, so naturally I've always wanted to include it in my portfolio. But the problem is like, if you go say, hey, Mr. Boss Man, I wrote a bunch of emails, it just doesn't sound nearly as impressive as, hey, I wrote a 3,000 word script for a JRPG.
Right.
I originally did consider making this just into a book, but serialized fiction will always leave its fingerprints on the work when you compile it. You can see this in the repetitive nature of something like 50 Shades of Grey, which is a book I don't like, by the way, but you can see the cycles of conflict repeat over and over and over again until all of a sudden something a little bit more spicy happens, and then the book suddenly ends. And you can sort of see that anytime, though, you do this with serialized fiction. Now, these things are expected, and they're sometimes even bonuses of serialized fiction in that they continue them longer, and it lets you retread familiar ground without straying too much from the repetitive, without making it too repetitive, especially in fan fiction, where the series is written often as the writer is going. It's more of a, and it's not necessarily as planned ahead, so you end up getting this sort of performance art aspect to it, where what's going on in the story is kind of a view into the writer's real life as well. And it's got this sort of community feel that published one-off works or even published series just do not have. And I didn't want to initially take the time to sand off all the fingerprints of it being a serial fic originally. Plus, when I looked at the indie fantasy scene on Book Talk or on TikTok, I just kind of didn't feel like there was a good place for my work in that market. And on top of all of that, I did initially have the writing itself free online, and literally I could look at the stats of it. Even with my growing YouTube channel at the time, 0 people had read through the whole thing, which is fine, but it's just a format that people are just not that interested in. I considered turning it into a kinetic visual novel, which, if you don't know, that's a visual novel with no choices, and but because, I kind of already wrote it like that, I actually don't have dialogue tags in the way that I've written it. I just have the character names in front of the dialogue, because when you're writing an email, you don't really need proper English. You're kind of to the point. And so I started looking into the business side of visual novels, because if we're going to try to make this more marketable, you might as well go all the way. I'm not a business person, by the way. I used really big, wide guesstimates to make business decisions. For me, it's not necessarily I wouldn't necessarily recommend this. But I ran what are called box leader numbers, and that's basically just estimating the revenue of a game based off of review count. And I actually have them here. Let me throw out some numbers for you on kinetic visual novels. So Juniper's Knot only made $4,000. Higurashi, the whole series, probably made about $300,000 USD on Steam, averaging 400 reviews per game with $50 for the whole bundle. And House of Fata Morgana made $1 million USD. Now, I ran these numbers a year ago, so they might be higher today. I don't know. But I picked these out mostly because these were the handful of kinetic visual novels I've actually heard about. And I'm not saying there aren't more and other more successful ones I just haven't heard about, but I figure if I'm kind of representative of my target audience, I'm as good a sample as any for this wild estimation. But the problem is that this paints a pretty stark picture, honestly. Like, for me, this is like 6 to 8 years of work when this will be over, and that'd be like a couple thousand, maybe. Or realistically, we're looking at the 300,000 if I'm super lucky and go viral. And I'm not saying that's not life-changing money, but like I'm saying, in the most miraculous scenario, would be compensated less than like a normal salary for my current magnum opus. Compare that to here's a list of games that I ran for of Vox Leader numbers I ran for RPG Maker games. You've got like Rakuen, which has like 4,000 reviews and over 100,000 in profits estimated. You've got Moon, which made like 8 million, or Amori, which made 20 million, or even like more obscure titles like Wada Nohara and the Great Blue Sea, which made 0 because it's free, but its manga adaptation has 260 reviews on Amazon, so probably if the original game came out, the creator could have, and for money, the creator probably could have made bank on that because it has so many reviews on its not game part of the game. Like, so most of the game's players are not going to have read the manga. They're probably just going to have played the game because it's free. So if you have that many reviews, they're probably making big money. So what you can sort of see is that the upper end on these successes is just simply much higher. And even looking at more recent titles like The Coffin of Andy and Lele, which is at about 12 million right now, and the game isn't even out, or Look Outside, which is a really recent game that I think just cracked the top 30 RPG makers ever sold on Steam, and in like the last year. Like, what I'm saying here is that from all that, the gamble on just the genre alone is just a lot better. There's a lot more opportunity to make actual money. Now, is this a high chance for me? No, but it's a better than like none chance it would be with a visual novel. So thus, All the Promised Fern is going to be a knowledge-based RPG. As I mentioned before, it's kind of like where the knowledge checks from Dungeons and Dragons are opening up more of the world, and you can apply different knowledge to unusual situations to get unique outcomes. Like, for example, if something might seem like the most obvious thing is to use your nature check on a natural scenario, but you might also have knowledge of a story told about this kind of scenario, and so then you bring in your story and history and literature knowledge to apply to a nature scenario. And then sort of also tying into my love of immersive elements, I'm planning on having a lot of mini games. Like, I've got a mini game for combat, I've got a board game that I've implemented into the game, and hopefully here soon I'll have a mini game for eating with chopsticks for the first time. Just these little things that'll be immersive, juicy game elements that you can sort of play with and toy with in a way that'll make you feel like you're in the story. Now, I've probably talked about, I just went on this huge rant about the business, so I don't want to just clarify that I'm not here just to make money. But the reason the business element is still important to me is because I really do believe in this story, and I love this story. So making smart business decisions will enable more people to see it. And it will also allow me to continue to order copious amounts of bubble tea.
So game designer, does any of that overlap with RPG game design, tabletop RPG game design, like D&D or Pathfinder, like you said you participated in, or is it 100% just like video game design? Like, how much overlap is there between those two things?
I would actually say that from a numerical perspective, the overlap is pretty big, because I find while in any computer-based game you can get away with bigger numbers that are more because the computer is calculating them, and you can get away with more complex calculations, I find that the games that people really dig into the system for end up being the ones with more simple calculations, because that means that the average person can understand how to engage with the actual RPG system of the game more. For example, Pokemon, to go for like a really popular example, that's an RPG. It's basically just glorified rock, paper, scissors, though, right? Like, obviously, you can get really deep into it with the CEDs and the move sets and stuff, and I'm not a big Pokemon person. But on a surface level, though, to get started, as long as you just know that, fire beats grass, grass beats water, water beats fire, and then you just extend that to all of the other elements that are in Pokemon, you already understand the basic elements of this system. So I think that having designing your gameplay system in a way that if you were to engage with it in a tabletop way, that you have these people that are going to optimize their builds, where they can be like, okay, this piece of armor gives me +1, this food item over here gives me +1, and then these boots give me +1. That's +3. That's gonna absolutely, clean up the shop when I go fight those rat enemies again. I think that's what is the interesting part of system design. That's the part that's fun, is people getting to look at the numbers and feeling like they're really smart. And I think this isn't to insult the average gamer, but I think the average person doesn't necessarily want to do actual calculus to play video games. I think the average person wants to feel like they have done calculus and succeeded at solving the equation to optimize their gear for whatever they're trying to do. And so in that regard, I feel like there's a lot of elements of the sort of core economic engine that you're making with the numbers and such in a tabletop system that apply to a video game.
So, that is very interesting. Wait, so did you ever consider turning your Worlding game like into a TTRPG? Like,
I actually do have a tabletop RPG for it.
No way, I didn't know that.
I need to do. Yes, it didn't sell very well. I think it only sold like $100 gross, but it nonetheless exists. It's called Little World of Fates. It's on the old lore though, because it's came out I think like 6 years ago now. And the art and formatting is not as pretty as you probably would want a tabletop RPG PDF to be. It's $10 on itch.io. I'll send you a link so you can link it below. It is in fact a game about building factions and building the faction's followers. But unlike, for example, in Pathfinder, where to build your faction, you literally have to make like 1,000 you end up making like 200 Pathfinder characters for each person in your faction, and that's crazy. The average person, I think, it takes like 2 hours to make a Pathfinder character, right? So the average person is already spending a lot of time if they're playing Pathfinder. Who has time to basically run giant spreadsheets of like 200 characters when they have like a full-time job? Not me. So this game is meant to enable you to sort of still min-max a really crunchy system around building a faction, but it's a little bit more lightweight so that you could do this without necessarily having to be aware of like 300 different books worth of stuff. And it also, it's also a classless system, so everything instead is just you get feats, basically, that your character that all go on to different characters, and the feats all tell something about a story, or all story elements too. So even if you're sort of a more crunchy character builder sort of person, and you're trying to play with people who are like, I want to just play my cool sorcerer person, then they can also just be their cool sorcerer person, and that's not going to severely limit their capabilities in comparison to you, min-maxy bro, who's, making all of your big fancy faction people as powerful as possible. Both of you will have quite a bit of power in this system, is sort of how I've set it up.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So there are a lot of different ways and approaches that people take to the creative process. What is your favorite part?
I think for me, as you can probably tell from this my YouTube channel, my favorite part of the creative process is probably the world building and the brainstorming. I mean, it's like I said, it's the frosting on the cake. I also like being done with things. There's this book called The Six Types of Working Genius by Patrick Lencioni, I think. Um, and he points out that basically different people are best at different parts of a project, and I do best at starting something and ending something. In that I don't feel like I've succeeded at doing something until it's done, but because of that, funnily enough, the brainstorming part is also really easy to be done with, because once you come up with an idea, it's done. So, I find the early stages and the late stages of something probably my favorite parts and the easiest for me.
And what about the least favorite part then?
Yeah, well, as you can imagine, that's the middle. I would not necessarily say that I have great discipline. That's working on things every single day, doing maintenance on databases, backing up my files. These sorts of things that are on a day-to-day basis enable me to continue to work. Cleaning, chores, dishes, these things that do end up inevitably being kind of adjacent to having a creative life, is that it's like, well, I have to maintain my actual life too, and I am not good at these things. I'm fortunate that working on games and world building and creative stuff doesn't really register as work for me, so it bothers me less. But once I have the start of an idea, I'm not necessarily the best at seeing it through to the end. Given that I know this is a weakness of mine, I have developed a lot of habits over the years to combat this, so you might not necessarily be able to tell that from the way I work today. But that's because I've failed a lot in the past to finish things. I think my number one trick to making sure that I actually can get to the part where I finish things, because that's the part that makes me happy, is that I try not to commit to too many projects at once. I get a lot of what you would call like creative crushes on project ideas, and I try not to pursue them too much, and instead focus on my committed relationship with Isaiah and All the Promised Bird, if you will.
Hmm. Um, so the next question is, game development has many different aspects to it: art design, writing, world building, and so on. What is your favorite and least favorite aspect of that? Like, is there a part of it that you're just like, man, I wish I could just like work on this only?
Yeah, I mean, like I said already, the world building and the writing part of it, like, I became a game writer because that's the part that I love the most. My least favorite aspect is coding. I despise coding. It's probably good for me, though, and I always feel smart when I successfully crack a tough problem, but that's mostly because I'm at a stage where I don't need to code things well, I just kind of need things to work basically. Um, I also really don't like animation because it's either extremely tedious or it also involves coding and then it's really technical and hard. And either way, I'm bad at it. Illustration on its own is fine, but animation is just not for me. So I'd say coding and animation are probably my biggest weaknesses in terms of game design, whereas doing the writing and the world building comes very easily, and I don't really consider that, almost doesn't feel like real work. Anytime I was able to do that on one of my paid projects, I really didn't feel like I was working. I kind of just felt like I was messing around.
Hmm. So we talked a little bit about the different inspirations: Made in Abyss, Game of Thrones, Violet Evergarden. Uh, each one of them is very different when it comes to their character creation and the way characters are handled in the plot, narrative, and world. What is your approach to character creation? Is it similar to the way you world build, or is it different?
Yeah, so my character creation process is probably pretty similar. It's really intuitive. It usually starts with me coming up with an vague character idea or like a vibe. I'm pretty much always scrolling on Pinterest and seeing beautiful and interesting looking people and saving that, and I say I want to put them somewhere in this world. Then I usually end up picking a goal of some kind for this character, and then that's the thing that the character is actively going to try to do in the story. as well as a core wound for them. And this is sort of a false belief they have, or the thing they're trying to avoid above all else. And once you have the vibe, the goal, and the wound, the character is pretty much complete. I don't really find those, write down what your character favorite breakfast is and what do they wear in the morning to be very useful. I find the sort of questionnaires, I find it much more useful just to know their like vibe, goal, and wound. Because every other fact ends up sort of becoming obvious about them once you have that framework in place, because you can easily deduce it from these three things. Interestingly, though, in tabletop RPGs, as we've been talking about, I've learned, especially when I'm DMing, that it's wise to also pick something for the character to be best at or to have the most of, because this keeps them memorable in the players' heads as well as gives players reasons to interact with them later. If I was ever making a more open world sort of game or an immersive sim, I'd probably want to implement this rule for myself as well, so that, because in games where the players need to go to characters for resources, you need interacting with these characters ends up being like pulling levers to make the plot go in specific directions. So I suppose this is pretty similar to the way I do my world building, in that I start purely with what's interesting to me, and then I structure it in such a way that it's well tuned to the story engine I'm using.
Right. Okay. So, with all of that, do you have a favorite or a least favorite character, or one that was the easiest to write or the hardest to write?
I think I have a least favorite character, in the sense that I don't have any characters I dislike. I actually think it's kind of mean to try to write a character that you actually hate and you don't have any empathy for. So I think I end up basically only writing characters for whom I will feel affection, because I understand where they're coming from. Even if they're like a little bastard, I still love them. I'd probably have a character for whom I feel the least amount of affection, but at this point they're probably some sort of small throwaway side character that I have forgotten about, so I couldn't tell you who they are. My favorite characters are naturally my protagonists. After all, if I was going to, since I've limited time on this planet, so I'm going to write indulgently about the people I love. And so, we've got Arlisair, who's sort of my self-insert in the grand traditions of Dante and John Milton, in that she has a lot of misunderstandings about her place in the world and what it means to be loved and what it means to love. Of course, we have Diacaeus, who ends up, I suppose, very minor spoilers, ends up becoming a POV character. He is the senator and also the father of artificial intelligence in my world. He is the man who invented the nuke, and now he's having to figure out how to use it responsibly. And with all of these different characters, the thing that ends up being, with each of them, they do all kind of have their like anime trope elements, but when you end up digging down into them and figuring out what actually makes them tick, I think that's and like all of the misunderstandings they have about the world and the way that the actions they take lead to more conflict, but at the same time it could have never gone any other way because they couldn't have chosen anything else. I think that's really beautiful. So that's sort of the thing that I find to be my favorite thing about writing characters. As for the characters that were easiest and hardest to write, Arlisair's voice comes really easily to me. Some of the other very difficult women in the story, I'm a big fan of writing. My saying is I support women's rights and women's wrongs. I love writing women who are extremely difficult, because I find that in a lot of media, people tend to be a lot more unforgiving of women, so simply because I assume it has something to do with society and gender norms, and I won't delve too much into this today, but I like writing these really difficult women who are nonetheless empathetic. I don't know how much I'm succeeding at making them empathetic to people, but I'm trying to write these women who are clearly like very difficult people with particular standards that have certain quirks that are actually insufferable, but at the same time you see why they have them. You understand where they're coming from. I find them very easy to write, because I find most women in real life even the ones that people consider to be difficult tend to have a pretty good point about why they're being the way they are. Um, and in contrast, I find the women that are, or sorry, not the women, I find the people that are the hardest to write are the characters that are intended to be sort of the Machiavellian geniuses of the world. I'm not that smart, but because I regularly, hang out with a bunch of other, like, really talented uh, engineers who are, like, zooming through their careers, I feel like I end up wanting to write a lot of characters based off of them, particularly my fiance, because I love him and he's wonderful. But obviously, since I'm not that clever, I don't do logistics very well. Sometimes I can't even logistics my way into a proper grocery list. So I don't. So I definitely struggle with them, and I especially struggle with their linguistic landscape because they're going to use words in ways that I wouldn't necessarily think to, or use words that I might not necessarily have on the tip of my tongue. And while I so my hardest character was Zalathiel, the Inquisitor General. He isn't introduced until like the second or third act, but the reason he's difficult is that in addition to being smart, he is young, so he wants to demonstrate that he's smart. So he does put a lot of effort into using really difficult out there words, like so I basically had to go into a thesaurus to learn a bunch of new words for him, which I know that that's not necessarily always the best way to do this. Like, you don't really just want to thesaurus every single word that a character says, but I want him to sort of just drop appropriate but intelligent sounding words into his speech. He uses a lot of chess metaphors that I also don't know anything about, so I've had to look up a bunch of stuff like that. I have another character who her whole thing is that because she was a demon who was taught shape-shifting from an intellectual standpoint rather than an emotional one, she knows like the names of every single bone and muscle in your body. So when she talks about how other people are interacting or moving through the world, she ends up using these really specific words for parts of her hand, or if she's in a fight, she's describing very specifically what got cut or stabbed. And obviously, as a person who doesn't necessarily know as much, like doesn't have a doctorate level understanding of anatomy, that was something I had to look up a lot. So I guess as to actually sum up, any of the characters that are hard to write are the characters that are specialists in something that I am not. So I end up having to figure out how to make their linguistic landscape reflect their specialty without sounding like an idiot because I don't know any of these words.
That's a very eloquent way to like put that whole thing. I think it's a really ingenious way in order to create character uniqueness, so not everyone sounds the same or views the world in like a similar lens. So with that in mind, what is your technique for writing plot? How do you balance it with world building and character creation, as well as like this sort of after conflict story that you're telling?
For me, plot is king. If you're writing a story but you don't have a plot, you just don't have a story. But for me, plot arises naturally from building characters who are actively trying to achieve goals and factions that need resources. Because now it's basically a game and everyone is trying to win, and you are describing the actions they're going to take to get there and how far they'll go to achieve their goals, or if they end up finding out that they have something else that they value even more than this goal that they're allegedly achieving. To figure out what's happening on like a moment-to-moment basis, I tend to use what I think is called the scene sequel method, where basically your protagonist or antagonist takes an action, that's the scene, and then the sequel is writing what happens after they take that action, what's the fallout. Now, an important part of this, I think, however, as a writer, is that you have to, if you want this to work, you have to not be afraid to break the status quo. You have to be willing to make your characters suffer the consequences of their actions. the more you shield your characters from the consequences of their actions, the less dynamic your plot's going to be, which actually might be useful in like a cozy story, or in like a comedy where you know, it's one of those comedies where everyone's always going back to the same one room, and you know, the plot doesn't ever actually change that much. You just get funnier and funnier jokes because the people are have more and more callbacks. But I think for me, the like key thing with a plot is your characters have to be willing to change the status quo, and in fact, they should be probably upset with the status quo. Now, you can also have characters that specifically want to maintain the status quo, and so they're taking, you know, drastic actions to also make sure that it stays in place. But those drastic actions are going to have to be proportional to the actions of the characters trying to break the status quo. So that's my biggest rule with the plot: is don't be afraid to make crazy things happen pretty much immediately.
So to kind of conclude, what advice do you have for those who are starting out on their own projects, web serials, animatic YouTube series, animations, novels, games, any of it?
So, no matter what field, I think there's two things that are going to be the most important for you to remember when you're starting out. One of these things is gentle advice, and the other is going to be a little more tough love. The first piece of advice is that you have to know that when you start something, you are not going to be good at it at first, and that doesn't matter. There is no moral failing in being bad at art, unless you're accidentally promoting eugenics or something, and you don't want to be promoting eugenics. Maybe get rid of that. But aside from that, it is that's a kind of an extreme case. I don't know how you would end up accidentally doing that. So otherwise, it is totally valid to be a beginner in a creative field, and it's even valid to stay as a beginner in a creative field. For example, I dance. I've been dancing every day for like a year, and let me tell you, I suck at it. I still suck at it, and I might never actually improve, and I certainly will never be a professional dancer. But I love dancing. It makes me feel happy and good, and I love striving to get better, even if I'm not necessarily getting better at a whole. Maybe I'll get better at a specific dance. And, like, you know, guess what? No one is bullying me about improving my health or moving my body around because dancing is good for you. Being creative is good for you. Writing is good for you. Drawing is good for you. So there's nothing wrong with being bad at something or even doing it unconventionally. So you just gotta start. I have a friend who whenever she opens up a Word document, it's too intimidating for her. So she does all of her writing in Discord messages, and sometimes I'll just see a bunch of Discord messages pop up in her writing channel, and that's how she does it. Or, you know, for me, as I've mentioned, I don't like animation, but back in high school, I wanted to make a big animated movie. So what did I do? I got dolls. I did like the audio track for it, like you would do in animation, and then I played it and I moved the dolls around with my hands. And it didn't look good, like it didn't look great, but it conveyed what I wanted, and it sort of led me to start developing my own sort of techniques and storytelling techniques around the limitations I had imposed on myself, which led to some really unique ways of handling it. And probably if I had continued to pursue my doll animation, I probably would have gotten better at it eventually. But in the meantime, however, it served the purpose that I wanted, in that I had visuals that explained the story I was trying to tell. So basically, don't be afraid. Don't worry about your tools at the start, because it doesn't matter. You just gotta start and start getting, because once you start, you're gonna get more both mental models and literal tools under your belt, techniques you can try that will lead you to get better. But in order to get better, you have to start. And I know that this is sort of very helpful advice. This is sort of advice is aimed at people who, you know, have that, what is it called? Rejection sensitive dysphoria, and so they feel, which I think is a very common symptom of ADHD and autism and stuff, and probably some other neurodivergencies. So a lot of them try to cope with it. A lot of my friends, anyway, who have these sorts of issues will try to cope with it by, just doing a ton of research, but at some point you have to stop doing research and just get started, because you are not gonna know what you don't know until you start encountering the actual hurdles of doing the thing. But there's nothing wrong with not being perfect at start, so you just gotta go. Now, number two, however, is that you are the only person, not the only person, but you are the person who cares the most about your work. No one else will ever care about your work, about the thing you're trying to make, as much as you do. So if you ever want to finish anything, you do have to develop discipline or systems that enable you to finish it. And part of that is the discipline to work on projects that you can reasonably finish with your skill level, rather than chasing whatever shiny, cool thing sounds good. And part of that is staying committed to that project. Obviously, if you're burnt out or something, don't force yourself to keep doing something that you're doing for fun. Like, if this is not your job, should just stop. Because if it's not fun, then and it's your hobby, then why are we suffering for no reason? It's supposed to be a hobby. But if you're trying to take it like seriously or professionally, you do have to push through some of the uncomfortable stuff. But at the same time, once again, if you're burnt out, there's a difference there. You'll figure it out for yourself. But nonetheless, you do have to have the discipline to keep going eventually. Like, you can't give up. You can pivot your end goal to make it more achievable, but you can't just, you have to develop comfort with encountering problems and not knowing what to do next. And the comfort with not knowing how to do everything. And because no one can come in and solve it for you, because once again, you are the person who cares the most about your work. So if something stops feeling fun because your friends don't read every single chapter anymore, or because you aren't met with uproarious applause every single time you post a new picture that you've done for your art, then you can't just be like, well, I guess I don't want to do this anymore. You have to, one, find new friends who will support you on your little steps, probably friends who are also on a creative journey, who understand that you need that moment-to-moment support. But two, you also have to recognize you aren't owed other people's time and attention just because you did something. You have to earn it by making that something good. And so part of that is accepting, once again, that because you are the person who cares the most about your work, other people might not necessarily be inherently drawn to the things that you are drawn to. That's not a bad thing. And in fact, if you just find more people that are drawn to the things that you're drawn to, then that problem will get solved. But on the whole, you have to accept that you're going to be the person who cares the most. And that means if you want something to be done, you have to be the ones to conquer the problems in the way, to have the discipline to finish it, and to surround yourself with the other people that are going to appreciate it, even a fraction as much as what you do. So, now, like I said, sort of with that, it's important to develop both systems and also have people around you that can support the kind of work that you want to do, even if you are the person who cares the most about it. But it is a good thing to internalize, because once you have that in your head, you'll take actions that will support a world in which that is the case. And that's the tea.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. I will link your YouTube channel below if you guys want to check out Amaiguri's work. It's really fantastic. I love the art style of it. I think it's a really, really, really unique world building and game project. Please go check it out if you're interested in that type of thing. And that's all I have.
All right. Thanks so much for having me. I look forward to us potentially collaborating in January.